The photograph should be ordinary. That is what makes it dangerous. It is a cabinet portrait from 1868, album and print, cleanly mounted, the kind families ordered after the war to reassure themselves that life had resumed its proper shape. A father seated at center, a mother beside him, three children arranged with practiced symmetry. Behind them, a painted backdrop of the Capitol dome rising through an impossible blue sky. Reconstruction optimism, rendered in oil and canvas. At first glance, there is nothing to see. But look at the father's left hand. It rests on the shoulder of the eldest daughter, placed where a photographer might have suggested a gesture of paternal care. Yet this is not an embrace. It is a grip. The fingers are driven deep into the flesh above the collarbone, the knuckles pale, the tendons raised like cords under the skin. The fabric of the girl's dress puckers under the pressure, pulled tight at an angle that betrays strain. This is not how a hand settles when it means comfort. This is how it clamps. If you understand why his fingers are dug so deeply into her shoulder, you will see not affection, but a crime being committed in full view of the camera. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. The discovery came quietly, as most buried things do. An archivist at the National Library was digitizing a Reconstruction-era collection. Routine work, thousands of images passed beneath the scanner's glass. The photograph had been cataloged for decades, labeled simply Family Group, Washington, D.C., 1868. It had never been singled out. No red flags, no marginal notes. Nothing to suggest it deserved more attention than the hundreds around it. It was only when the resolution was increased, when the file was rendered in modern clarity, that the anomaly emerged. At 4K, the image stopped being a symbol and became a record. The archivist noticed the hand first because it did not blur. In an era of long exposures, hands were notoriously difficult to keep still. They softened at the edges, dissolved into suggestion. This one did not. It was sharp, anchored. The pressure seemed to stabilize it, fixing it in place with purpose. The girl's shoulder, by contrast, showed tension everywhere. The line of her neck pulled taut, the skin stretched, the faint distortion of posture that suggested resistance rather than repose. Zoomed further, other details began to whisper. The daughter's gaze did not meet the lens. Her eyes slid past it, unfocused, as though the room had already begged to recede from her. Her mouth was closed, but not set, neither defiant nor sullen. It hung in a neutral line, emptied of intention. A look archivists would later describe cautiously as glassy. The archivist did what archivists are trained to do when something does not fit. Nothing at first. She logged the file, saved the scan, and moved on. It was only later, hours later, after the image refused to leave her mind, that she returned to it, isolating the hand again, tracing the pressure points, measuring the unnatural indentation of cloth into flesh. This was not incidental contact. This was force. The photograph, once harmless, now read differently. The Capitol backdrop, symbol of law, order, and civic virtue, loomed behind a private act of control. The father stared directly into the camera, chin lifted, expression composed. He was not ashamed. He was daring the lens to contradict him. The archivist flagged the image for review. In the language of archives, that is how accusations begin. What the photograph truly captured would not reveal itself all at once. But the first truth was already visible, embedded in silver salts and paper fibers. Whatever this family had gathered to prove that day, whatever version of themselves they meant to preserve, it required pain to hold together. And the camera, indifferent and patient, recorded every second of it. Once the photograph was flagged, it was passed, not to law enforcement, not to medical experts, but to a historian. That choice alone says everything about how the image was first understood. The consultant brought in was a specialist in post-Civil War Washington, a scholar whose work focused on the fragile reassembly of political life after collapse. He approached the photograph as a product of ambition, not pathology. In his reading, this was a campaign artifact, nothing more sinister than a carefully staged performance of domestic stability. The father was identified quickly: Arthur Sterling, 42 years old in 1868, a mid-level clerk in the Department of the Interior who had survived the war by mastering a single skull, appearing indispensable while remaining unremarkable. Men like Sterling filled the capital in those years: papermen, committeemen, men who learned that advancement depended less on brilliance than on cleanliness. No scandal, no noise, no visible disorder. That year, Sterling was preparing to stand for a higher appointment. Not elected office, but something nearly as sensitive: a supervisory role overseeing land claims in the Western Territories. It was a position that demanded public confidence, moral uprightness, proof that the man could be trusted with order. And in 1868, order began at home. The historian pointed out what the archivist had not initially considered. Family photographs of this type were not made keepsakes. They were instruments. They were sent to associates, displayed in offices, sometimes reproduced in local papers. They testified to normalcy in an era obsessed with degeneration and decline. A man's household was read as an extension of his competence. From that perspective, the photograph made sense. The daughter, Elizabeth, aged 14, would have been at an age considered difficult, even under ideal circumstances. Adolescence, especially in girls, was widely described in the period as volatile, unruly, and prone to moral weakness. Manuals warned fathers to guard against female excitability. The idea that a teenage girl might resist sitting for a formal portrait did not trouble the historian. It confirmed expectations. The grip, he argued, was not a sign of abuse, but authority. In his initial report, the gesture was framed as an act of suppression, not violence. A father enforcing compliance to preserve a necessary illusion. A moment of coercion in service of reputation. A domestic tyrant, the historian wrote, acting within the norms of his class. There was precedent. Letters from the era described fathers physically correcting posture during portraits, restraining restless children to avoid blur. Pain, if applied, was incidental, an unfortunate but acceptable cost. The photograph in this reading documented a willful girl being forced into stillness for the sake of the family's public image. It was a comfortable explanation. It allowed everyone involved to place the act within a known moral framework. Authoritarian, yes, but not criminal. Harsh, but ordinary. A man disciplining his household under social pressure. The historian contextualized the Capitol backdrop as further evidence. Sterling was aligning his family visually with the state itself. Stability reflected stability. The father's stare into the lens was not defiance, but resolve. This is who we are. This is under control. For several weeks, the investigation stalled there. The archivist felt it, though she could not yet articulate why. Something in the explanation rang hollow. Tyranny usually announced itself more crudely. Anger left marks: flared nostrils, clenched jaws, visible rage. Sterling's face showed none of that. He was calm, deliberate, focused, and Elizabeth did not look rebellious. Teenage defiance had a vocabulary the historian knew well: tightened lips, rolled eyes, stiffness that signaled resistance. Elizabeth's body told a different story. Her tension was not oppositional, but total, as though every muscle had been recruited for a task she did not choose. Still, without further evidence, the official hypothesis remained intact. A father under political pressure, forcing a difficult child into compliance. A small cruelty in service of ambition. No one yet suspected that the photograph did not record suppression of will, but suppression of movement itself. And no one at that stage had asked the most dangerous question of all: what would have happened if the father had let go? The rebellion theory collapsed under magnification. When medical historians were asked to examine Elizabeth Sterling's face, not as a symbol, but as a physiological record, they noticed something the political reading had missed entirely. Her expression did not fluctuate across the exposure. There was no micro-tension of resistance, no tightening at the corners of the mouth, no asymmetry suggesting suppressed emotion. What appeared instead was absence. Her eyes were open yet unanchored, as though the act of seeing had been separated from attention itself. At extreme resolution, another detail emerged. The muscles along her neck were fully engaged, drawn tight in a way inconsistent with voluntary stillness. This was not the posture of a sulking child forced to behave. It was the posture of a body fighting itself. That observation triggered a second line of inquiry, one that moved away from politics and into medicine. The District of Columbia's medical ledgers from the late 1860s are incomplete, their pages thinned by humidity and bureaucratic neglect. But Sterling's name appeared more than once, buried among billing records from private physicians, whose practices specialized in what the period euphemistically called nervous disorders. The visits were not routine. They were frequent, clustered tightly in the months leading up to the photograph. One ledger entry, dated 5 weeks prior to the sitting, listed repeated purchases of laudanum, an opium tincture commonly prescribed for pain, hysteria, seizures, and behavioral control. The dosage was high, higher than what would have been necessary for simple anxiety, high enough to dull consciousness itself. Another notation followed, written not in English but in compressed Latin, the language physicians used when they did not wish families or courts to understand the implications of a diagnosis. Chorea Sancti Vitae, St. Vitus's Dance. The name sounds folkloric, almost harmless, but the condition it described was not. Chorea caused involuntary, chaotic muscle movements, jerks, spasms, tremors that could seize the limbs without warning. In adolescence, it often followed illness and could last months or years. The body became unreliable, stillness impossible. In the 19th century, such symptoms were not read clinically. They were moralized. A girl whose body moved against her will was described as disordered, unstable, sometimes even possessed. Medical texts blurred easily into theological judgment. The archivists cross-referenced the date of diagnosis with the photograph. They aligned perfectly. The laudanum explained Elizabeth's vacant gaze. Opiates, administered in sufficient quantity, could quiet movement by dulling sensation and inducing shock-like detachment. But they could not fully override the spasms of chorea. Not for 15 seconds. Not without assistance. The grip, then, took on a new meaning. This was not a father restraining rebellion. This was a man counteracting a neurological disorder with force. His fingers were not positioned to threaten, but to anchor, pressing into the trapezius muscle where pain could override involuntary motion. A crude but effective method. Pain interrupts chaos. It forces the nervous system to reroute. Suddenly, the stillness made sense. So did the sharpness of the hand. Pressure stabilizes. It eliminates blur. A further search uncovered correspondence between Sterling and the photographer. Letters not preserved in the official family papers, but in a private collection tied to the studio's business records. One sentence written in irritation stood out. "The girl will not remain still without assistance." Assistance. No mention of defiance. No complaint of temperament. Only motion. The photograph was no longer ambiguous. It was not capturing a family at rest, but a crisis managed in real time. Elizabeth's body had betrayed the illusion her father required. The state would not tolerate visible disorder. The asylum loomed behind any diagnosis that could be seen, documented, proven. And photographs were proof. If Elizabeth blurred, if her outline ghosted even slightly, any physician, magistrate, or rival could read it as evidence. A moving girl was a dangerous girl. A girl who could not control her body could be taken, legally, and confined indefinitely. The hidden layer of information did not soften the image. It sharpened it. This was not a moment of discipline. It was a calculation. Arthur Sterling was not asking his daughter to behave. He was asking her body to lie. To understand what was happening in that room in 1868, you have to understand what illness meant in Washington after the war. This was a city rebuilding itself on paper. Committees, bureaus, commissions, order imposed through documents. And when the body failed to obey order, the state had remedies that were swift and absolute. A young woman whose muscles jerked without permission was not considered merely sick. She was unstable, a liability. Under district law, a physician's recommendation, sometimes a single observation, was enough to commit someone to St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the insane. Families had little recourse once the paperwork was filed. Patients vanished behind brick walls and iron gates, often for life. St. Elizabeth's was spoken of softly in polite company. In private, it was feared. Patients were restrained, bled, sedated, submerged in cold baths, meant to shock the mind into submission. Mortality was common. Discharge was rare. Arthur Sterling knew this. Elizabeth's first episode had likely occurred months earlier. An involuntary jerk of the arm, a sudden tilt of the head, movement small enough at first to be explained away as nerves. But the body escalates when ignored. By the spring of 1868, her condition would have been impossible to conceal within the household. Servants noticed. Visitors noticed. Movement attracts attention. Attention invites intervention. Sterling did what men of his position always did when confronted with a threat to reputation. He sought control. Physicians were consulted discreetly. Laudanum was administered carefully, increasing in dose as the symptoms worsened. Curtains were drawn. Elizabeth was kept upstairs, away from windows. The house adjusted itself around her disorder, like a structure built over a fault line. But medication was not enough. The photograph was scheduled deliberately. A formal sitting at a respected studio, with a capital backdrop chosen to align Sterling visually with governance and stability. The image would circulate. It would testify. It would contradict any rumor of illness. Only one problem remained. Elizabeth could not be still. Exposure times in 1868 ranged from 15 to 20 seconds, an eternity for a body in rebellion. Even a single spasm would smear her features, distort her outline, betray everything Sterling was trying to deny. Blur would be read as defect. Movement would become evidence. So Sterling prepared. Elizabeth was dosed heavily before leaving the house. Enough laudanum to dull sensation, slow reaction, thin consciousness. It left her compliant but fragile, her awareness floating somewhere behind her eyes. Yet even drugged, her muscles would not fully submit. Inside the studio, the photographer arranged them quickly. Chairs positioned, backdrop fixed, light adjusted. He would later write that the sitting was uncommonly difficult, though he never explained why. Sterling stood behind his daughter. When the moment came, when the photographer called for stillness and lifted the lens cap, Sterling applied pressure. Not randomly, precisely. His fingers sank into the muscle where pain travels fast and interrupts involuntary motion. He pressed hard enough to hurt, hard enough to command the nervous system's attention. Pain, unlike medication, acts instantly. It overrides spasms by force. Elizabeth did not cry out. Laudanum dulled her voice as it dulled her thoughts. Shock held her rigid. Every fiber of her body focused on a single sensation, compressing chaos into stillness. 15 seconds. 20. The camera drank the image. When the lens cap was replaced, Sterling released his grip. Elizabeth sagged slightly, caught by her mother before she could fall. The photographer averted his eyes. No one spoke of what had just occurred. The photograph worked. Elizabeth's face emerged sharp, her outline intact, her body apparently obedient. The image lied convincingly. It presented a healthy girl, standing calmly beneath her father's hand. But the cost was immediate. Accounts from later correspondence suggest Elizabeth collapsed upon returning home, trembling violently, her muscles rebounding after restraint. The laudanum dose was increased. Her room became permanent confinement. The tragedy was not that pain was inflicted. The tragedy was that it succeeded. For one frozen moment, violence achieved what medicine could not. It rendered Elizabeth acceptable, and in doing so, it sealed the path her life would follow. Hidden, managed, and controlled, not for her survival alone, but for the preservation of a man's future. The photograph captured the exact second when protection and harm became indistinguishable, and history until now chose not to look closely enough to tell the difference. The photograph might have remained an inference, powerful, unsettling, but ultimately circumstantial, if not for a box that should never have survived. It was found misfiled in a commercial archive, not among Sterling's papers, but among the effects of the photographer himself. Studio correspondence, invoices, complaints about lighting, and clients who blinked too often. Ephemera, the kind of material rarely read twice. One entry, dated 3 days after the sitting, was written in a hand tightened by irritation. The Sterling family appointment was the most difficult sitting of the year. The girl required extraordinary measures to remain fixed. No elaboration followed, no moral commentary, just professional frustration. At first glance, the note seemed to confirm the historian's original reading, an uncooperative child, an unpleasant session. But archivists, now primed to distrust appearances, read it differently. The language was precise, not restless, not defiant, unfixed. In 19th century photographic jargon, fixed referred not to temperament, but to chemistry and motion. To fix an image was to arrest it before it dissolved. A subject who could not be fixed was a technical problem, a body that refused to obey the physics of exposure. The archivists went further, reconstructing the technical constraints of the studio itself. Exposure times in that year averaged 18 seconds under optimal light. The Capitol backdrop, painted in pale tones, reflected illumination unevenly, increasing the risk of blur. The photographer would have known immediately that Elizabeth Sterling posed a problem that could not be solved with verbal instruction. And then came the twist, the realization that reoriented everything that had come before. The violence in the photograph was not punitive, it was functional. Arthur Sterling was not punishing his daughter for resistance. He was not venting anger. He was performing a task. He had converted his own body into a stabilizing device, using pain as a mechanical solution to a physiological obstacle. His grip was not expressive, it was instrumental. In that moment, Sterling was not a tyrant asserting dominance. He was a man executing a rescue operation by the only means available to him. If Elizabeth blurred, she would be lost. A blurred face would not be read as a photographic failure. It would be read as pathology. Physicians, rivals, even acquaintances could point to the image and say, "Look, she cannot stand still. She is unwell." That single defect would justify intervention. Orders would be written. Doors would close. The grip prevented that. Pain blocked the spasms long enough for the image to lie convincingly. Sterling sacrificed his daughter's comfort and a portion of her bodily autonomy to preserve her legal status as sane, domestic, and controllable within the home. The photograph was not evidence of abuse meant to harm her. It was evidence manufactured to save her from something worse. This is what makes the image unbearable. Elizabeth's empty gaze is no longer passive. It is the side effect of opium and shock, her consciousness pushed to a place where pain could not fully reach her voice. Sterling's stare into the camera, once read as authoritarian pride, becomes defiance of a different sort. He is daring the system to contradict him. He is presenting a forged reality and daring anyone to prove otherwise. The photograph is a document of fraud, a carefully constructed lie created under duress, with the father as both perpetrator and accomplice. It declares, "My daughter is normal. She can be still. She belongs here. And for that single instant, it worked. What the camera captured was not cruelty for its own sake, but a desperate calculus made under a legal regime that equated visible illness with forfeiture of freedom. Sterling chose pain over disappearance, control over confinement. But the twist does not redeem him, because once violence proves effective, it becomes policy. The photograph succeeded in saving Elizabeth from the asylum, but it also proved to her father, to the household, to the future, that her body could be subdued when necessary. The image did not just preserve her place in the home, it taught everyone exactly how much force it would take to keep her there. Once the technical and medical evidence was aligned, the photograph ceased to be ambiguous. Its meaning narrowed, sharpened, and became far more disturbing than any initial interpretation had allowed. This was not a family portrait. It was a document engineered to deceive. Every element of the image now read as deliberate. The capital backdrop signaling civic trust, the rigid symmetry of the bodies, the unnatural stillness achieved at visible cost. Even the absence of blur, once a mark of quality, became incriminating. Stillness, in this case, was not proof of health, but proof of intervention. The photograph existed to answer a single unspoken question posed by the era's legal and medical machinery. Can this girl be trusted to remain within the home? Arthur Sterling needed the answer to be yes. Elizabeth's illness could not be cured, but it could be hidden. And in the 19th century, what could not be seen could not be processed. No physician could certify madness from rumor alone. No magistrate could order confinement without demonstration. Photographs, increasingly, were treated as neutral witnesses, objective, incorruptible. Sterling exploited that belief. The image reframed Elizabeth's condition as non-existent. Her body, momentarily subdued, testified falsely on her behalf. The photograph did not just preserve her presence in the household, it rewrote her medical reality. Seen this way, the father's grip becomes the central mechanism of the fraud. It is the hinge on which the entire illusion turns. Without it, Elizabeth moves. With movement, the system activates. With the grip, the system is stalled. The mother's posture gains new significance as well. She does not look at Elizabeth. Her gaze remains forward, unfocused, but compliant. She is not intervening. She is complicit. Whether through fear, agreement, or exhaustion, she accepts the method as necessary. The photograph is not evidence of love, nor even of cruelty alone. It is evidence of governance at the smallest scale, the family adapting itself to satisfy the state's requirements. Pain is applied not out of malice, but out of policy. Elizabeth's face, emptied by opium and shock, completes the illusion. Her glassy stare is read by viewers as calm, as obedience, as health. No one looking at the image in 1868 would have questioned her capacity. That was the point. This recontextualization forces a more difficult conclusion. Arthur Sterling did not merely restrain his daughter once. He demonstrated that her body could be overridden when necessary. The photograph was a proof of concept. It showed that Elizabeth's illness could be managed through confinement, medication, and force, without state involvement. From that moment forward, the asylum was no longer the only threat. The home became one. The photograph's success eliminated external danger, but it intensified internal control. Elizabeth no longer needed to be seen as sick. She needed to remain invisible. Visitors were limited. Outings ceased. Her world contracted to rooms where movement could be monitored and corrected. The image that saved her from institutional disappearance condemned her to domestic erasure. This is the photograph's true meaning. It marks the point at which Elizabeth Sterling ceased to exist as a public person. She survives in the record only as an artifact of her father's ambition. Her body used as evidence in a case argued silently against the future. The photograph tells the world she is fine. It tells us she is not. It captures the exact instant when care became indistinguishable from captivity, and when survival required the permanent surrender of freedom. In that frozen frame, Elizabeth is neither patient, nor daughter, nor citizen. She is a problem solved, temporarily, by force. And the camera, faithful to its task, recorded the lie so perfectly that it endured for more than a century. The photograph did what Arthur Sterling needed it to do. Within the year, his appointment was approved. His name appears in the records exactly where ambition intended it to appear: clean, untroubled, advancing. The image circulated quietly, shown to the right people, placed where it would be seen and never questioned. No physician challenged it. No magistrate intervened. Elizabeth Sterling was not committed. Officially, she remained at home. And then, she vanished. Not in the dramatic sense historians prefer. No death notice, no scandal, no sudden disappearance that demands explanation. Elizabeth vanished administratively. After 1868, her name ceases to appear in public documents. She does not attend social events. She is not listed in church confirmations, charity rolls, or census margins, where unmarried daughters were typically noted. It is as if she receded backward into the house itself, absorbed by walls and corridors that kept her out of sight. This absence disturbed researchers more than a recorded death would have. Further digging revealed that Elizabeth did, in fact, live for decades after the photograph. Private estate records and household expense ledgers, never meant for public view, confirm her continued presence. There are entries for laudanum purchases spanning years, payments to seamstresses for clothing that never appears in photographs, occasional notations for repairs to a second-floor bedroom door, a lock, a reinforced frame. Elizabeth lived another 30 years. She never left the house. No visitor accounts describe seeing her. Servants' testimonies, recorded much later, speak of a quiet young mistress, kept upstairs, her windows covered even in summer. Food was carried up. So were medicines. Her movements were managed, anticipated, corrected. The asylum never claimed her, but neither did the world. Arthur Sterling died respected, his reputation intact. Obituaries praised his service, his dedication, his family values. Elizabeth is not mentioned by name. She is implied, folded into the phrase survived by relatives. Even in death, she remained unspecific. What the photograph accomplished was not rescue in the way modern eyes want to interpret it. It did not restore Elizabeth to life. It merely changed the location of her confinement. Instead of iron gates and stone wards, she was given wallpaper, curtains, and silence. The father saved her from St. Elizabeth's Hospital and sentenced her to house arrest. This is the final cruelty embedded in the image. The moment that appears, at first, to be salvation is also the moment her future collapses inward. Once the photograph proved that force could hold her still, that pain could make her acceptable, there was no incentive to imagine a different outcome. Control worked. So, control continued. Elizabeth's life became a series of managed stillnesses, each one extending the logic of that first grip. Her body was no longer allowed to contradict the narrative that had saved it. Disorder could not be tolerated because disorder invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited loss. So she was hidden. The photograph became the only proof that she had ever occupied public space. One frozen moment where she stood among others, visible, acknowledged, falsely whole. Everything after it retreated into shadow. The image remains deceptively calm. To an untrained eye, it shows a family holding itself together in a fragile era. But now we know what it truly records. The exact second a life was spared and extinguished at the same time. Elizabeth Sterling did not disappear into an institution. She disappeared into obedience. And the photograph, the lie that saved her, also ensured that no one would ever come looking for her again. The archives end there. No redemption. No recovered voice. Only a still image, perfectly sharp, preserving the moment when a father's hand closed and never truly let go.